Alright guys, my name is Goblin, and today we are covering another weird spec from the Burn Crusade expansion, the Fire Warlock. So this is a destruction warlock that focuses on all of the fire damaging spells rather than using Shadow Bolt. And what's interesting about this spec is that it isn't really that much of a meme spec, to be honest. I've been playing this spec for 2 months now on a TBC server, and in some circumstances it will do more damage than a typical Shadow Bolt spec. We'll talk more about that later, but I honestly think that the Fire Warlock is the spec that Blizzard actually intended for people to play if they were going to spec into Destruction. There's a lot of talents in the Destruction tree that increase your fire damage, but don't increase your shadow damage. The only reason why people obviously prefer to go for a Shadow Bolt Warlock when it comes to raiding is obviously because of the improved Shadow Bolt talent, which is just ridiculously overpowered, especially when you decide to stack multiple Warlocks. But a Fire Warlock is a little bit of a secret beast, because say for instance if you don't have a Shadow Priest in your group to provide the 15% increased shadow damage debuff called Shadow Vulnerability, then if the group has a Fire Mage in the group that provides basically the same kind of buff up for fire damage with the improved Scorch talent, then the Fire Warlock will do more damage than a Shadow Warlock. So it's actually a great spec to play with in Karazhan groups if you don't have a Shadow Priest in the group and do have a Fire Mage. And honestly, it's a way more interesting rotation and just generally much more interesting and cool. So let's take a little look at the talents. First of all, we're not actually going to dip into the Destruction tree because I'm going to obviously highlight the Demonic Sacrifice talent, so you will still use this talent like you do as a Shadow Bolt Warlock. However, you will not sacrifice Succubus, obviously, because you will sacrifice the Imp for the increased 15% fire damage. What's great about playing a Fire Warlock is obviously the Imp doesn't need a Soul Shard, so you save a lot on your Soul Shards for when you're obviously wiping and doing progressive raiding, because you will need at least a good 30 Soul Shards before a raid, and you're going to burn a lot less Soul Shards when you're sacrificing your Imp. All of the talents here, they're really just used to get further down the tree, and obviously to increase your stats slightly. So Demonic Embrace, Fell Stamina just increases your health slightly, Fell Intellect increases your intellect slightly, Improved Health Stone, we need it for obvious reasons. Thing here, Demonic Aegis increases the spell power you get from Fell Hammer, so that's quite nice, and then you have the convenience of Fell Domination with Master Summoner. But anyway, let's talk about what the Fire Warlock is mainly all about. So obviously the deep, burning fire talents that are in the Destruction tree. So first of all, we spec into Cataclysm because we don't need this improved Shadow Bolt, so we may as well just spec into that. Next we have Bane, pretty standard talent, reduces the cast time on your Immolate by 0.5 seconds, which increases your DPS by a margin. And then we're going to go for, you know, the typical Ruin spec where you max out Devastation and get Ruin, because it obviously will also benefit the fire damaging abilities, which are Immolate, Incinerate and Conflagrate. We'll obviously talk more about the playstyle and rotation later. From here we get Intensity, because for the slight chance that you do get melee damaged or damaged by anything, you have that reduced, you know, cast interruption. Demonic Reach just simply increases your range. Then we have Improved Immolate, so this is where the talent build starts to change, because Improved Immolate increases the initial damage of Immolate by 25%, which is quite a big chunk. This is really nice, particularly when Immolate decides to crit. Then Ember Storm, we want to increase our fire damage by 10% and reduce the cast time of your Incinerate by 10%, which means that Incinerate has a significantly shorter cast time than Shadow Bolt. Next we have the cooldown ability Conflagrate, which is an instant casting ability very similar to Shadow Burn, but does a little bit more damage. In fact, fairly similar amount of damage. And obviously this also removes the Immolate debuff on the Tiger. We'll talk a little bit more about the rotation and how that is interesting later, but this is basically a really hard hitting instant cast fire damaging ability, which is really nice because a lot of the time when you're playing a Shadow Bolt Warlock you just have to hard cast all the time. You can't really do that much damage when you're on the move, but you can in the Fire Warlock spec because you can use Conflagrate obviously while you're moving. Next we have the Backlash talent. We mainly get this for the 3% increased crit rate, but it also has a 25% chance when hit by a physical attack to reduce the cast time of your next Shadow Bolt or Incinerate by 100%, so it makes your next Incinerate a totally instant cast, which is extremely useful for when you want to decide to do some solo farming, some solo questing, but you don't want to really respec into like something like the Siphon Life and Soul Link build, which is great for farming. You don't really need to do that much. Obviously that would be more optimal, but because of Backlash you will just start melting enemies really quickly and efficiently. And lastly we have Shadow and Flame. Your Shadow Bolt and Incinerate spells gain an additional 20% of your bonus spell damage effects, so that's obviously just a flat 20% damage increase. You can also opt for the Pyroclasm talent by taking 2 points out of Emberstorm, and this is particularly useful for when you're clearing dungeons in an AoE group, for instance with a Protection Paladin. Now you may be thinking, well, isn't it just better to just sacrifice your succubus and spam Seed of Corruption? And yes, that will provide more DPS even when you are spec'd in Fire Spec. However, it's obviously very time consuming and it's a bit annoying having to sacrifice your succubus and then sacrifice your imp again over and over again for when you're doing single target or AoE damage. Personally, when I play Firewalk, I just prefer to either do Rain of Fire or Hellfire, because the damage from it isn't actually that bad, plus it generates a lot less aggro than Seed of Corruption, so it's a much more reliable and sustainable form of AoE damage. Yeah, it will do more damage, but it is slightly safer, and this Pyroclasm talent makes it even safer, because every time you use Rain of Fire or Hellfire, every time it ticks, you'll have a chance to stun the target for 3 seconds, with a chance of 26%, so it only takes about 3 ticks of Rain of Fire for you to get guaranteed stun on a target, and it is for 3 seconds. And this is really useful for smoothing out big AoE pulls when the Protection Paladin is under a lot of pressure from multiple different enemies. You're going to provide that little bit of crowd control that reduces the damage on the tank, and it also reduces the chance of you or anybody else in the group under any kind of threat when they're doing their AoE damage, because obviously the target will be stunned, and when a target is stunned it can't jump to the mage or the warlock to do melee damage. So this is quite an underrated talent. It's also really useful for when you're soloing classic WoW dungeons for farming gold and things like that, so it's a talent that I would actually recommend getting until you are doing very serious progression raiding, because you will want that extra 4% fire damage from the Emberstorm talent. So let's talk more about the abilities, the rotation, and the overall playstyle of the Fire Destruction Warlock. So compared to the other specs in TBC, it's actually one of the more sophisticated kind of rotations. Although it may appear quite simple, trust me, like most of the other specs in TBC are still pretty simple. First of all, we have the Immolate ability, so it does an initial damage, and then it also burns a target over 15 seconds for considerably more damage. With this ability, we keep it up 100% of the time, because that debuff is a considerable damage increase, and if you want to take it a little bit further, you want to snapshot it just as your spell power trinkets become available, or proc or whatever, whenever you decide to use them, and then you refresh it just before the trinket falls off to continue benefiting from that spell power buff after the spell power buff has fallen off. Then we have the Incinerate ability, which deals fire damage but also deals an additional amount of damage when you have Immolate on the target, so obviously that's another reason why we want Immolate on the target 100% of the time. And this is your main filler ability, very similar to Shadow Ball, although Shadow Ball isn't by definition a filler ability because it's your only ability as a Shadow Wall. Next we have Conflagrate, ignites a target that is already afflicted by your Immolate, dealing a certain amount of damage and consuming the Immolate spell. So another reason why we want Immolate on the target is also because you simply cannot use your Conflagrate ability in your rotation if Immolate isn't on the target. You may be thinking, well, isn't the fact that Conflagrate removes Immolate off the target, isn't that kind of frustrating? But honestly it's not, because it's the only thing that really makes this rotation somewhat interesting. Because obviously you want to time your Conflagrate just as Immolate is about to fall off, but you also want to time Immolate and Conflagrate with your spell power buffs. So overall I found this, from 2 months of playing this spec, the rotation is actually very fun and challenging, because if you execute absolutely perfect timing with your rotation, you can massively push an extra 100 to 200 DPS out of your character. So let me show you the Fire Destruction Warlock in action, give you a precise overview of the actual rotation. So first of all, obviously just going to put Immolate on the target, and then you're going to use Incinerate pretty much until Immolate is about to fall off. So obviously I don't have that many add-ons on this server, but when it's about to fall off and it's got like 2 seconds left, you obviously need to time this in with your Incinerate casts too. You don't want to be in a situation where Immolate falls off because you're waited for Incinerate's cast to finish, which is why I'd recommend having a stop casting macro, obviously to stop the cast on Incinerate, but you also want a spell that just uses Conflagrate normally, because you want to use Conflagrate as soon as humanly possible after an Immolate. So obviously you want to take advantage of latency to squeeze out a little bit of extra damage, so if you use an Immolate like this, and you're spamming Incinerate, if you spam Conflagrate, you're going to get Conflagrate in a little bit earlier. But obviously if you have a stop casting macro, you will stop the Incinerate cast, so you want 2 macros for Conflagrate essentially. On top of this, it is important to time your abilities with spell damage trinkets like the Dark Iron Smoking Pipe, which is from the Diabrew Festival, which I definitely recommend getting when TBC comes out. So let me show you an example of this. Say for instance, to pop the trinket like now, and then obviously the damage of Immolate is going to be massively increased. And as you can see, it's about 12 seconds left, so we have to wait a little bit. You're going to mainly just spam this. And when just before your trinket is about to fall off, you quickly cast an Immolate and squeeze in a Conflagrate to obviously for his abilities to benefit from the increased spell damage. Now this Immolate that's rolling over target, it still believes I've got the spell power trinket active when I don't. The only time you're not going to use Conflagrate to remove Immolate is when you are benefiting from Heroism or Bloodlust, because obviously you just want to squeeze in as many Incinerate casts as humanly possible before that buff falls off. Another very big advantage the Fire Warlock has over a Shadowbolt Warlock is they simply do a lot more damage in dungeons because they can squeeze in more damage before the mob dies. Because obviously they can use Immolate, use a few Incinerates, but then they can squeeze in Conflagrate into Shadowburn for a huge big chunk of execute damage in a short 2 global cooldowns. I will always do more damage than a Shadowbolt Warlock in Fire Spec simply for that fact. But anyway guys, that's where I'm going to end the video there. I will be making a more detailed Fire Warlock guide coming very soon. But anyway, my name is Medagoblin, so in my next video, ciao.